Cameron George. What's up, my man?
How's it going, man?
I'm so stoked to talk to you, dude, because I love Kava. Is it called Kava or Kava Kava?
You know, Kava is more of like a Western name.
Screw the West.
Right. Yeah,
let's
exactly.
Let's go OG indigenous. Okay.
Right.
I love Kava root. And also, I feel as though I've spent a lot of money, time, and energy thinking that I'm going to get the benefits of Kava and then not. And so when we started talking, and I'm like, holy shit, this guy has niched down on this one particular plant, like very deeply. I was so excited to talk to you. So for those of you listening, you're like, Kava or Kava Kava, what the hell is that? You will soon find out. And trust me, you're going to be very grateful that you did. Having talked to you briefly before the interview, though, you also have a pretty hardcore origin story. You've struggled a lot with your health. So give us a truncated version of what led you to eventually getting really into these medicinal plants and herbs and whatnot.
Right, yeah. You know, just like so many probably of you out there listening, this whole sort of odyssey for me started with chronic illness. You know, long story short, I was 19 years old and ended up developing a debilitating set of autoimmune symptoms. That it was sort of like an inflammatory cascade that eventually led me to be totally handicapped. At times I was unable to walk. I was unable to feed myself. I was, you know, developing all kinds of crazy food allergies, nerve system disturbances, eventually started having seemingly random convulsions in my nervous system that eventually led to seizures. And actually, you know, became allergic to so many things. I was having violent reactions to foods that would either put me into severe anaphylaxis or into a grand mal seizure, right?
Dude.
Or sometimes both at the same time, you know.
God.
Almost unconscionable. I mean, I didn't even believe it while it was happening to me. It's like, you know, how can a seemingly healthy 20-year-old who's an athlete in college, you know, an endurance athlete actually, you know, and, you know, running at university and such, and you know, working 3 jobs, health just totally collapsed all at once. And it wasn't all at once. There were some signs now, but I didn't know how to recognize those back then, right? You know, so
was anyone able to identify the root of where these issues came from at the time?
Yeah, you know, like so many, you know, people today who are chronically ill, there's a lot of contributing factors that build up over years' time prior. It's like, you know, I definitely believe at this point, from everything that I understand about chronic illness now and, you know, the development of it, that I certainly had genetic susceptibility there. It's like most of us do that develop diseases that other people don't, right? So it's like you have certain susceptibilities, I'm sure, and then you get exposed to a myriad of different stressors in your early adult years, and you probably, if you're just a standard young guy, then you have all kinds of toxic habits, you know, when it comes to, you know, dietary choices and drinking and
Domino's and Budweiser and Marlboro,
exactly,
and all those,
you know?
American standard.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Those dietary standards we keep as young people,
Yeah.
some of us.
And I was set up, my nervous system was set up in a way that was sort of hyper-impulsive. I was one of these types that was sort of prone to addiction and sort of a, you know, self-compensatory strategy type of, you know, thing or sequence where I would very easily addict to things, right? Whenever I was, you know, very young, it was food, or it was a combination of different things, whether it be activities or, you know, even ideas at times or thoughts and so on. And, you know, at a certain age, you know, whenever I got into, you know, teen years, high school years, early college years, it turned into drugs, you know. And I
would know nothing about that, by the way.
Having listened to the podcast,
I've been a complete angel my whole life.
Right.
I totally don't relate. No, go on.
Who does drugs at 18?
Right?
Years old,
Why would
right?
you ever do that?
Yeah, exactly.
It's not fun.
But it was to a level of excess that was quite self-destructive. I mean, you know, things imploded pretty quickly on me at a very young age and ended up in all kinds of trouble, right? You know, both physically and, you know, all my, you know, relationships, friendships, family, all that kind of stuff, you know, too. And, you know, so I, at a, you know, pretty early age, I shifted most of my addictive, you know, propensities towards, you know, athletics and running in a ditch effort to actually try to do something that was like positive for myself, right? And that actually turned toxic on me because then I ended up overtraining, and that was a huge contributing factor on top of all of the damage and that had accumulated from toxic habits, lifestyle, and things, and probably the susceptibilities that were in place. So, with these situations, it's always very difficult to pinpoint one thing, like the one thing. But I do know that there were certain things that definitely sent me over the edge. One of those things, no question about it. Well, first of all, I ended up in a moldy apartment. While I started to get chronically fatigued and started to deteriorate from just living a very overly excessive lifestyle. I ended up in what I later found out was a mold-infested apartment where we found Stachybotrys and such.
How did you come to that realization? Because I think a lot of people. I mean, I know at different points in my life, just based on symptoms and based on where I lived, that I've been exposed to mold. But how did you get to the root of that? Because I don't think a lot of people, A, understand that's an issue, and B, would even know how to effectively test for it, and then what do you do to remediate it, et cetera.
Well, and actually, I wasn't clued into that at all at that stage in my life. My dad actually knew someone who suggested this because I had a bunch of animals in my apartment, and they started randomly dying.
Oh, shit. What kind of animals did you have?
Right. So I actually had, and there's a reason for this that I'll get to. I ended up with a bunch of exotic animals. I had a few monkeys.
Are you serious?
A couple dogs. I had, a few parrots.
Was this part of your the manifestations of your obsessive? How do you say that word? Obsessiveness.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay,
sort of
right.
the OCD kind of thing,
Yeah.
or the hyperimpulsivity and such.
Yeah.
It was, but that wasn't even normal me at all.
Oh, okay.
Actually, the main toxic stressor that sent my whole system over the edge was actually the thing that brought about those kind of behaviors, like randomly buying animals and such. And that was that when I started to get fatigued from overtraining and all of these other different things.
Is having a monkey even legal?
So I came from Arkansas. I was in Arkansas, and
Okay.
I didn't really go down that road or know or care, but I'm pretty sure it's not. I'm quite sure it's not.
Was one of the animals that died as a result of the mold a poor little monkey?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
God.
Unfortunately.
That's like a giant human-like canary in the coal mine.
Exactly.
Oh, poor
exactly.
monkey.
And that's one reason why I tell the story, because it's an important sign of like how
their souls.
How toxic mold is, and
Yeah.
that whole thing was a horrible thing, and I hate that happened, but really so is an expression of what I'm about to tell you there, and was also being one of the main stressors that sent my nervous system really into a very, very degenerative situation. And that was whenever I started to get fatigued from overtraining and all these different lifestyle factors. I ended up, just like most people would at that age, not knowing anything about upkeeping my own health or anything like that. I ended up in a psychiatrist's office in which I was prescribed Adderall. For my fatigue, actually, and, of course, diagnosed with the standard, attention deficit.
Oh, that'll fix fatigue, all right.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And, of course, gives you the illusion, right, if you're a kid and you're like, oh, yeah, this did it, right, Here, you're fatigued, taking
What was your experience? I'm just painting Adderall as negative because apart from one person that I've met in my life that still takes it and derives a lot of benefit from it, as I was telling you earlier, which is Maston Kipp, a recent guest, every single person I've ever met that's taken Adderall, it completely wrecked them in one way or another. Sure. Where was that in the journey, and was that the final tipping point, or did it get worse?
It was the catalyst that turned up the notch. It amplified all of my pre-existing impulsivities that were just relatively, normal, especially in today's age as far as impulsivities are concerned. And it put them on steroids and basically put me into a psychosis, and my whole life broke down, relationships, friendships. Thank goodness I was mostly self-destructive during that time. I didn't really do anything, to anybody else or anything like that. But that was basically my experience with it. And, just to be clear, with drugs like Adderall, my view of them is always that they're a tool, just like other, psychiatric drugs. Like a scalpel, you can save someone's life in surgery. You can kill yourself with it. And, some drugs have far less of an application, in my opinion, than others, as far as like to maintain safety. Because, certain drugs go off of this principle, or I'd say most drugs, of borrowing from tomorrow to pay for today. And that's sort of like what you're doing, like with an amphetamine, right? It's sort of like an override button for the nervous system, which in the short term, right, it's like if you need to get some stuff done, or you're a CEO of a company or something like that, you take Adderall, or it's, in my opinion, a little bit less, aggressive counterpart, modafinil or something like that, then you do get, a lot done, and so people may use it for that and such. But in my case, I wasn't even like thoroughly assessed like at all. I was I was literally just walked into this office and they gave me this drug that I didn't even know what it was. I didn't know anything about chemistry or pharmacology or anything like that. And they actually told me, they said these words. They said, "This is a miracle drug," and sent me out of the office, right? So no blood tests, there was no test besides just like, "Oh, you're fatigued?" Yeah, you know.
That's really interesting because the one person that I mentioned, Maston Kip, who I didn't know this, but on the show he told me, yeah, I take Adderall. I was like, whoa, God, you seem happy, healthy, balanced. And he is prescribed it, and it's a more mild version of it if I'm getting the story right. But the important part of the story was he went to Amen clinics and did brain scans and saw how for him, and I'm not an advocate for anything other than what was working for him, but he saw scans of his brain and was able to figure out how Adderall could actually help him stabilize for whatever neurotransmitters. I don't know what the deal was, but I think that's a clue into why he's one of the only person I've personally ever met that has an ongoing use history of Adderall. And he's super stoked and it's working for him and he seems really happy and successful and awesome. But he wasn't shooting in the dark like you. He went to one of the most renowned brain analysis clinics in the world, and they're like, yeah, this is where these molecules fit into your particular system, and here's exactly how much you take, which I think is a pretty low dose.
Right, so it was at least targeted, and he gathered some information and found out which parts of his brain, were functioning high or functioning low or whatnot, and then, saw the results. As far as like acutely taking it. And I've actually had SPECT imaging too, like later on, like after a lot of this ensued. But that's actually an interesting, thing too, because I always had kind of wondered too, whenever we do SPECT imaging scans, whenever you give a drug, and I don't know, you may know this, like, do they do them acutely, like right after giving the drug to see what happens, or do they follow up long term?
Yeah, I don't know.
Because that's the thing. It's like you're going to get functional changes if you temporarily activate a lot of systems in your brain that appear good in the short term, just like you feel good in the short term, right? Yeah, no, and so that's a whole discussion there. But it's
and this is not the Adderall episode.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I often, much to the chagrin of some listeners, they're like, "Let the guy talk," but there's so many things sometimes that I have to interject on because I'm like, whoa, this is a really interesting side note, which we didn't plan on talking about, and I feel there's benefit in someone who's thinking about taking Adderall, who has done it, someone who's having success with it, someone who's not, because it's very prevalent.
Yeah, and this is not at all to paint, any tool with a broad brush and say it's absolutely inherently evil. And I don't think that there is any drug that is like, most likely, maybe there's PCP or something, it's like, but it's not at all to say that. It's only my personal story, and I've seen a lot of things, and so could be a cautionary tale to do a little bit more investigation at very least, right?
There you go.
Whenever you're, because taking a drug is a huge life decision. It can totally alter the course of your life when you talk about getting on a drug, right? That totally alters your brain chemistry. So it's a good. That's a good point. a good side point about the whole thing.
Absolutely.
But anyways, back to the story about how that fits in, So
and thank you for being able to meander us back there when I take you on a side route. I appreciate that.
I know.
Sometimes the guest is like, "Wait, where were we?" And I go, "I forget too," and then we're screwed. So take us back into the story. Thank you.
Exactly. Yeah. No. So So anyways, so for me in my situation, Adderall was a catalyst in which I was, it's can be a huge stress in the body because it is a sympathetic activating drug, right? Like it literally keeps the body in a pseudo-sympathetic state, especially if it's it's fragile in any way to where it has a hard time regulating itself, right? So if you're sick and maybe you have poor metabolic function and such, putting an override button like jet fuel into a car engine or whatnot, could lead to some problems, right? And in my situation, it was the thing as where I had already accumulated a lot of factors. We talked about, the toxic mold, and I had a lot of different probably toxic factors that had accumulated maybe from dysfunctional detox pathways, dysfunctional mitochondria, who knows, But then, the Adderall was definitely the straw that broke the camel's back, or the thing that just, not only did it put me into a psychosis, but it absolutely did some serious damage to my nervous system, and objectively, there's no doubt in my mind in that because it really took its toll. So whenever I got on it, that brings us to the, back to the quick point that I wanted to make about I'm not a lunatic. I didn't just buy a bunch of random animals. That was actually part of the psychosis. Like amphetamine-induced psychosis is like I went on random buying sprees, and part of that included a bunch of exotic animals.
That is so, you're the first guest that's had that as a manifestation of some psychological issues they were having.
It was me and my psychosis realizing my lifelong dream of recreating Ace Ventura, Pet Detective.
Holy shit, dude! That is
Probably.
That is incredible.
Except for my life ended up in a place where it was more like a hodgepodge crossover between Ace Ventura and Breaking Bad. Because of the fest and the all the negative circumstances people exactly what I'm talking about, like that happen once you become a drug addict.
Yeah.
Led to more drugs and so on and so forth, right?
Sure. You start hanging around with lower and lower energy people.
Yeah, more and more toxic circumstances, situations. You care less about your physical health and diet whenever you're in that and those things than you even did before, and so on. And so it was really just this cascade that but the Adderall in and of itself, being on it, I was on it for 2 years straight every day. And I kept getting weaker and weaker and weaker as I was on it and more psychotic and so on. And, long story short, my whole life broke down. I ended up thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands, it had been spent in debt, and had done all this, damage to my life. And whenever I finally came to the realization, which actually happened through a drug experience, and don't have to go up on that rabbit trail, but I was introduced inadvertently in the drug world to psilocybin once, and it totally altered my perspective on self and my situation with Adderall. And within 5 hours, I decided I would never take that drug again. It totally changed the course of my life.
Dude, that is so interesting, because it wasn't until years after I had stopped my shenanigans in the drug world that I realized that I decided to stop in the middle of a heavy mushroom trip.
Yeah.
And it took me years to actually remember, and I had a psychedelic flashback, but just I was thinking, what instigated that? And I think telling my story, over the years when it was contextually relevant, and it really was the same thing. It was a mushroom trip, and I saw, oh my God, I am a complete and total loser. And my life is about to get flushed down the proverbial toilet forever. And then I came out of the mushrooms and partied hard for another year or so. But that was the glimpse. And I remember telling one buddy, I was like, I can't do this anymore. I got to quit doing drugs. And my friend's like, what's wrong with you? We're having a blast. And I'm like, no, I'm not. This is not fun anymore. So, yeah.
So you got the experience of the seed planting, right? Where
Exactly.
You didn't even realize at the time, but it opened certain doors and altered the perspective, inadvertently without you realizing it. For me, it was it was totally conscious, and it was totally I was totally aware of everything and made that conscious. It was the most powerful experience of my life.
Had you ever done mushrooms before?
Prior to that, no.
Oh, okay.
And then I continued. I have done, I've done, many sessions with psychedelics since, not in a long time, but there was a period of time where I was intrigued, to say the least, and always did it with intention, and always did it in a context that I thought was, respectful and setting, because it humbled me, right? And that's classic, psychedelic entheogenic experiences, right? Is that they tend to, confront us with the truth about ourselves and allow us to put all of the inner cogs and wheels on our mind in the layers of our ego out on the table, to where we can see them like a third party, right? And we can just be like, ugh, where it's one of those things where it's you can objectively see things from outside your subjective, compromised perspective. And which is why, so many people report that same thing, right, with drug addiction, whether it be an ayahuasca journey or, about with something like DMT or psilocybin or any of those things, right? So that was certainly a deal with me. And that actually is relevant to our topic, too, in a way that I'll get to. So I was at this point in my life where I had made the decision to stop. And at that point, I wasn't going back to that life, because I had created so much damage inadvertently, unknowingly, that I had to take responsibility for, even though a lot of it I didn't even really feel like it was me, because it was like a different person on the amphetamines and such. So at that point, I sort of had to, pick up the pieces of my broken life. And I did have a totally different perspective. And once I got off of it, I was left with this totally broken body. Like, the Adderall was still sort of propping up my nervous system, getting me through the day, but whenever I went off of it, my system completely crashed, Like, I was being held above water by like a floaty, or something, and it let go and I'm just drowning,
Deflated floaty.
because
Womp
my body,
womp.
yeah, exactly. It's like my body had been, beat down to a point, and its recovery system had even been beat down to a point to where I wasn't recovering. Like, I thought that it was just like withdrawal from it at first, whenever I went off, and it was like couldn't get out of bed, couldn't do anything. And in fact, I had so many cognitive deficits that I couldn't even leave my house because I was forgetting like where I was. I would have these memory lapses. I was starting to not recognize, faces of people in my family, like my parents,
Wow.
like crazy stuff. And I was
Wow.
explaining to people, and no one would believe me. I even went back to my psychiatrist and said, like, this has obliterated my nervous system and brain. And they're like, well, that's just your ADHD coming back. Why don't you just go back on it? I'm like, I can't do that, right? I won't be that person again, first of all. And secondly, it created all this damage. I'm not gonna kill myself on this thing, And it was one of those things that eventually I ended up in Louisiana at one of the most prestigious hyperbaric clinics. And this was after a long time of sort of diving into research with sort of my newfound perspective on things. This was like a year or two later of being totally dysfunctional and not able to get out of bed, and having to move back in with my parents, and being in a total state of basically like dementia. I mean, it was bad. It was like, it's just that whole period of my life was a blur. And actually, a lot of people didn't even believe that I was that bad. They thought that it was some sort of a psychological thing. And there was some psychological damage and trauma too. But I ended up, going to this place to try to get hyperbarics just because I was focusing on things just go in and, that could help my brain be able to recover, because my brain was what I was worried about the most because it was broken. And I ended up getting some SPECT imaging scans like you referred to earlier. And, the radiologist who interpreted the scan, they do a lot of, Alzheimer's patients and autism patients and a lot of, like elderly people. And he said that my scan, my SPECT brain scan, it resembled a lot of his 80 to 85-year-old patients with dementia. And at this point, I'm 22 years old.
Whoa, dude.
And then that was whenever I actually got the support of people in my family. That was so liberating for me because I got the support of people in my family.
You're like, look at these pictures.
They're like, dude, this is what this drugged into my brain. And I'm not saying that happens to everybody, but it's like, that was my situation. There's, whether or not it was the toxicity or just the Adderall or just the, it was all of it, and it was bad, and so that was a big time too, because I then got validation, which I already had internally, but so in that process I ended up on this sort of long odyssey to try to, because I actually did some hyperbarics and got some temporary effects, but I didn't retain much of it because my body was so unhealthy. Toxic, I later found out, and stuff too, So, basically I ended up on this long odyssey where I was, even though I was barely able to get around at all, thank God for the support of my family, my mom and dad, who are the best people in the world that I've met ever, just absolute godsend. But anyways, I was traveling around with my family, just exhausting the whole allopathic model first, going to different states, going to different places, inside, outside, places in the country. And I, obviously exhausted. Even I wasn't even willing to go back on medications, right? Because I knew where that led and stuff, So I was trying all kinds of different modalities, like the hyperbarics or like IVs or a lot of these different things that just like these one things, until eventually I had just literally been diving into just reading medical and scientific literature with the little brain function I had, which was amazing. I was able to do. It was just pure survival mode, I pulled together enough pieces, from the literature, from other things that people were doing, from health enthusiasts and podcasts, like yours and such. It wasn't around back then, but, others' podcasts and such. And I eventually gained enough of a perspective where I had some ideas, at least, of like, if I was going to be able to turn this back, like kind of where to start. And I actually came across, a doctor who's, one of my dear friends today, and we do work together. And his name is Dr. Dan Pompa. He's been on your podcast before too.
Yeah, great guy.
Yeah, he's an amazing guy, and he not only inspired me that I actually could get through it and such, but he offered me some context and some protocols, and he deals a lot in a system he calls true cellular detox, right? And in a lot of that, I had to deal with a lot of the interference, to get that out of my body in a systematic way, that wasn't going to make me even sicker and such, and that was years of doing that kind of thing. And I went down that road, and then I followed that up with, after the, getting out some of the bad, out with the bad kind of thing, the interference, a lot of regenerative medicine techniques. I did stem cells, things like that, stuff that you've talked about before. I even got some from Harry Adelson, who you've had on the show too before, or I've, did some stuff there with, well, that was, peripheral stuff, but then there's, I got some, multiple places. So there was a lot of things. It was a hodgepodge multi-therapeutic approach that really got me well. But, kind of back to, where I was at my sickest, right at the point where I met, Dr. Pompa and such, and we were doing some work together. I was in my absolute worst. I had deteriorated to a point where I was having these massive convulsions as a byproduct of, like I had mentioned before, these crazy allergies that I was having, to foods that I developed, which just happens when your immune system is so broken and your gut is so leaky and, your system is so inflamed that it starts developing these defense responses. And, we call a lot of this when people react to so many things violently. It's sometimes referred to, it's like a syndrome. People put you in this category, environmental illness, right? Or Gulf War syndrome, which a lot of people out of the Gulf War into this because of trauma and toxicity and such, or multiple chemical sensitivity, except for included other things like food sensitivities too. And basically the thought process behind that whole thing is that if your body's a metaphorical bucket and every toxic stressor, physical, chemical, or emotional, starts to fill up the bucket, once it gets to the top, overflows, you start expressing the symptoms of your genetic weakness. And one of those for me is you develop these crazy sensitivities to everything because your system is so overburdened, right? And chemical toxicity was a huge portion for me, because at that point, metabolically, I was so broken. My own detox pathways just from the average everyday process of, making energy and excreting the waste wasn't even working very well. And so I was sort of just getting more and more toxic and sick, along with everything else. But anyways, once I started to address some of those things, this was very slow. There was no magic bullet here. It was a multitude of different things and working a system for detox and also doing things like challenging my body through fasting, to get, the clearing out of a lot of these old damaged bad cells and going into ketosis for periods of time, coming out, adapting, trying to fine-tune things, targeted supplements and such. But the problem was I couldn't really do any of that at one point around the time that I actually met Dr. Pompa because my reactions were so bad that I couldn't tolerate anything, right? And I was having them so often that I was deteriorating so rapidly. And at this point, I had actually been for a couple years on a heavy dose of benzodiazepines just to stop the seizures, and the convulsions, which weren't even totally working, and I was deteriorating.
Are benzos like Valium?
Yes.
And
Xanax, Klonopin,
Xanax?
Valium,
Okay.
those kind of drugs.
Klonopin's one too.
Yes,
I didn't
yes,
realize that. I
yeah.
thought it was like a painkiller or
These
something.
sort of inhibitory drugs that are given to shut down anxiety, and that they're narcotic drugs, and they're even standard psychiatrists they're very hesitant to give them out because we hear a lot about the opiate epidemic, which is valid, absolutely. There's also an epidemic of benzodiazepine addiction, right? And
Dr.
alcohol.
Drew talks a lot about the benzos.
Absolutely.
And his clinical experience of working with people, especially people in recovery and stuff that get prescribed those too often and too many,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they're one of those drugs that you can literally die from the withdrawal process because you can go into seizures. So if you take them and eventually they stop working like most drugs do, because the body says we got too much of this, starts to shut down and down-regulate its production of certain chemicals that are creating the inhibition, that eventually you can get to a point where you start to get a blowback. The drug stops working, you reach your maximum dose, and then you try to go off of it, and you were having seizures before, but now you're having like a lethal seizure, like it's to a point. And so it's a very, very scary place to be. So I was in this situation where I had to find a way to modulate my nervous system while I was working upstream at the cellular level, right? Because that takes time. There's no like turning around a chronic situation like that in a day. So I needed to find leverage, but I was trying to look for something that could offer me some support. And I actually didn't expect to find anything that would give me equal support or even anywhere close. But I was desperate, so I was looking anyways. And having had past experiences with psychedelics and things like that opened me up to the power of plant medicine and even what I would see as like a plant intelligence and such and the complexity there and how amazing plant medicine can be, I was willing to give it a try, and to sort of look for something. I went down the medical cannabis route. Of course, I exhausted that, as anybody would. Didn't help. THC made things worse for me, and CBD just wasn't enough.
Anxiety and stuff. Yeah,
exactly. And
Yeah.
CBD just wasn't enough by itself. And actually, those things work for a great number of people, right? So it's good, but in my situation, it wasn't working, and benzodiazepines were. So I was trying to find a plant-based analog to a benzodiazepine, means something that worked in a similar way.
Here's
on the
where
same
the story
receptors.
comes together, my
Exactly,
friend.
yeah. Starting to converge.
I
Starting to
like
make
this.
sense. Yeah,
This is
exactly.
good.
Yeah, exactly. So I was looking for a plant-based analog that bound to the same receptors. So in this case, with the benzodiazepine, that was working for me, at least temporarily.
When you say the benzos were working for you, and I'm calling them benzos because the other word's too long to pronounce, and I can never remember it. But when you say they're working, was it to calm your nervous system, to lower anxiety,
Right.
the seizures? So
Right. Sorry. So
Okay.
all of the above. So
Okay.
so benzos are in a class of drugs called anticonvulsants, right?
Okay.
But they're also used for anti-anxiety because basically they inhibit the cells. They shut down the cells through a pathway that I'm sure you're familiar with. It's called GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid,
Sure.
which is basically the main calming chemical of the nervous system, right?
Right.
If
right.
glutamate is the most excitatory, that drives seizures and these kind of things, and excitotoxicity that can be exuded from toxins and all kinds of things, heavy metals and brain injuries. You get this storm in your brain that's glutamate driven. GABA is like its equal opposite.
Is that why monosodium glutamate jacks you up so much?
Exactly, yeah. That's actually where the
MSG?
research is going because it's a form of glutamate that induces
Wow,
excitotoxic.
I never made that
damage,
connection.
yeah.
That's trippy.
So it excites the neurons basically and creates a burning out, effect.
Right.
Glutamate's the most prominent neurotransmitter in the nervous system in the brain, but it's very carefully regulated. And it relies on a homeostatic balance of all the chemicals to keep it in check, and the intelligence regulates that, right? So the thing is that if you do anything and it gets out of balance, then it can overexcite the cells and produce a lot of free radicals in this free radical generation cascade as a result and damage itself, right? And, which is called excitotoxicity, right? And that's the mechanism through which people, like they have a brain injury and they start this storm, excitotoxic storm, or they get hit by, too much mercury, have susceptibility to, to certain things that contain mercury and such. It can start this cascade that can just persist and it
like
plays.
immunization shots?
Yes,
for
exactly.
example?
Yeah. I was waiting on you maybe to say
I
it.
don't say the V word.
Yeah.
You got to be careful with the
Exactly.
V word in today's climate. But
Oh,
yeah,
no,
that's
exactly. No,
definitely an issue,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, to people who are susceptible and such, for sure, that's one of the proposed mechanisms there, right? Is that excitotoxicity, and that's what happens when someone is in an autoimmune situation and they all of a sudden have these seizures. It starts with the immune system, drives up the nervous system because they're very closely, intertwined, activates this whole excitotoxic cascade, and the body essentially damages itself with friendly fire. And that's like what seizures are. It's like a lot of people on the autism spectrum where we now think and, so many physicians are now saying that it's autoimmune in most of these cases, right? And it's a bunch of contributing factors like with the whole autism thing. And the thing with that is that, you have an autoimmune situation, the immune system gets primed, and then a lot of these autistic cases, seizures are involved eventually, right? The immune system gets primed and the nerve system gets primed. This whole system gets out of whack, and you end up in this excitatory storm where the nervous system can't re-regulate itself, or the immune system too. And that was kind of the situation I was in. I was in a wheelhouse of that kind of thing, But anyways, getting
So
back to
if the benzodiazepines, did I get it right?
yeah.
If the benzodiazepines, now I'll remember in the future. Thank you for the lesson. If they were quote unquote working, what side effects made you want to find a plant-based alternative?
Yeah, exactly. Well, The situation that I was talking about with like after I had a perspective change, it made me very, very much aware of what psychotropic drugs like the Adderall and in this case the benzodiazepines, what I was sacrificing by being on those drugs, whole portions of my personality, right, in order to get those effects. But also, I was deteriorating because I was getting tolerance rapidly to them, which is something that you can get with benzodiazepines. And eventually, I was having to increase my dose.
Got it.
And I was getting
Okay.
sicker and sicker and sicker, and I was getting memory loss and these things because benzodiazepines, and this is something that, many, many doctors, physicians, scientists agree upon, is that they can be quite toxic to the brain, and you can end up with short-term memory. And to a brain where I already was in a situation where I was like confused and like, dementia at age 21, that was something that I was experiencing, and it was just like, and they were only going to work for a period of time because they were losing their effectiveness.
Right.
So I had a window of time to try to find something.
I forgot about the memory factor. I remember, I was never a huge, no pun intended. I was not a huge fan of pharmaceutical pills when I was using drugs recreationally in my past life. But at times, if I was desperate, I would take Valiums, like the 10 milligram blue Valiums.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking for more of a painkiller, anesthesia, opiate kind of effect, and they really don't have that, but they do get you kind of high in a downer kind of way. And so sometimes I would chew up a few of those and hold them under my tongue, and I would hang upside down and do like a sublingual heavy Valium dose all at once. And none of my friends would use that method. They would just be normal and drink a beer and take a couple of Valium to get high. But I was really looking to knock myself out because I was in so much emotional pain anyway. I digress, but one of the things about it is I just remembered this, again, no pun intended, is that my buddies and I, my drug buddies, we used to call them brain erasers. Because if everyone took a bunch of Valiums, the next day, literally, no one remembered anything that happened. Who drove? You drove? Well, that's terrifying. It was like I would end up in the weirdest places. I'd have no idea how I got there.
Wake up in a random apartment somewhere.
Oh, my God.
Blocks,
and then,
across town.
And then the next day, anyone that wasn't taking the brain erasers would be like, you guys were real weird. We went to all these different places and did this or that. And I would have literally zero recollection.
That's what I always thought was so funny, too, about
it is weird
about benzos. Like, whenever I was in that world, in the drug world and things where, that was my reality too, right? It's just like everyone I was around, it's, addicts of, you have different types, but I always thought that was humorous because I never was big on that. I ended up on benzos like whenever I was, really sick to stop those things. But I always thought it was funny that people would take them recreationally because part of the reason why you go out and do things is like to remember and recall it, right? And like, no one would know what the hell happened the night before at all. And whenever I did, even like a few times, every time that I took a benzo, I'd end up with like a DWI,
right.
Without exception, you know. And
it's weird stuff.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
Weird stuff.
And that was and then I was forced to get on them later on, and so I already had a very and so I was forced to get on, and I was deteriorating much more rapidly. Even though I was somewhat keeping the convulsions under control, I was deteriorating pretty fast. And I knew that once those things lost their effectiveness, then my system was going to ricochet in the opposite direction. The seizures were going to be worse than ever, and they were already to a point where they could have killed me. It was bad
so
stuff.
At this point, you try the medical, the cannabis, the
Mm-hmm.
CBD, not happening. What did you discover next?
Well, exactly, and so this had led me into looking at compounds that affect those same receptors. Since I knew that at least worked temporarily, but wasn't an option for me long term, I was looking, and I had obviously heard of Kava before, right? There's all the, the standard ones, chamomile, valerian, passion flower, lemon balm, all these things actually affect those receptors, but they're extremely mild. And any of those things, of course, I did try them, right? It's like, and tried them in all different preparations and so on. But, most of these things, were a little bit like trying to take down an elephant with a BB gun, right? It wasn't happening, right? It was like, they're good. And actually, I love those herbs to today for mild issues, but it wasn't happening. I needed something way stronger, and I didn't know if I was going to find that in the plant kingdom, but I was willing to look. And obviously, whenever you start reading about anticonvulsants or things that affect those receptors or anti-anxiety plants, you're going to come across Kava at some point, at least in articles or videos, or someone's going to say it. And actually, I had actually tried Kava before, and whenever I came across it again, I was like, I've tried this. It's just in that same sort of wheelhouse of it's not much better than chamomile. It gives effects that are basically the same, and it's not going to do what I thought. But something told me to really sort of look into it further, because I started reading too on whenever I was talking to people who I had met at that point and know and trusted, and a few of them were like, well, I think there's a lot more maybe to Kava than you think, and actually started straight up just contacting people like in the islands, the origin. I was just trying to go straight to the source. Like, look, I want to know the farmer who's growing this stuff and, how they've used it and if there are any differences there. And I ended up with, a whole host of different Kava materials that I had gotten from random people that I contacted and, started to develop some, rapport with, talking about Kava, and they were all saying the same thing. They were laughing whenever I said I had tried Kava. They said, "No, you haven't." Like no, you haven't. You've tried Kava, that name that they give to a capsule that you find in the health food store, which is actually a small shade of what Kava really has to offer, and doesn't actually contain the depth of it. So obviously, I gave a lot of these things a try, but what everyone was telling me too, and what I eventually found out, was that in order to get the full effects of Kava, and these effects that are written about, and that the indigenous peoples of the South Pacific islands, islands like Fiji and Vanuatu and Hawaii, has prized Kava so highly for, which they have.
Do you know how far the history goes back? Recorded history use, at least?
Right, exactly. So, Kava was, as far as we know that it goes back at least 3,000 years of use in Vanuatu. So in Vanuatu, we think was the origin of where it was discovered.
Vanuatu? I've never heard of
Vanuatu is right off of Fiji.
Oh, okay.
It's over there in the South Pacific. It's a cluster of islands. It's over there.
Oh, okay.
And Vanuatu is actually seen as sort of the home of Kava for that reason, because it has the longest recorded usage of Kava indigenously in multiple contexts. And it is a staple of their culture in Vanuatu. I mean, it is like they drink it for spiritual ceremonies, for social gatherings, for weddings, possibly even funerals. They drink it in most contexts like we would drink coffee over here, and it is something that is highly prized by them. And that's when I started talking to some of these people. I was like, this capsule that I got from the health food store, this is what all the fuss is about. There's got to be something more here. Investigating plants before and having taken really powerful plants like we talked about before, I just felt sort of intuitively that there had to be, because I know that cultures don't highly prize something like this unless it offers more than that, a little bit more than that, at least to the level that they do.
You don't have like the chamomile cultures, you know what I'm
exactly.
saying?
Or chamomile,
it's not
bars or something,
and it's not the staple of entire religious sect ceremonies or anything like that.
Exactly.
So,
and the effects, when I was reading in some of the anthropological accounts and talking to people in the islands and such, they were all saying, oh yes, it carries these effects like alcohol, but without the drunkenness. It's this huge social enhancer. It really helps you focus. It clears the mind. It's a pseudo entheogen. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like I was taking these capsules. It's like, dude, no, I didn't get any of that. And I was like taking half a bottle of this stuff just to try to like get any of those effects.
Had you ever tried boiling the whole root?
Right. Well, that's what I eventually was sort of told to do, is to experiment with the dry root, because basically, the form that Kava. Sorry if I haven't explained it so far. Obviously, is that traditional Kava, all these effects that I just touched on there, and these amazing effects that the indigenous people have prized it for, all come from a drink preparation. So Kava is a drink made from the roots of this shrub, Piper methysticum. So it's actually a small shrub in the pepper family. So Piper methysticum actually means intoxicating pepper, and it was one of those things that, so it's a drink that's prepared from that, and how it was traditionally prepared actually was, you would have the indigenous villages, hundreds of years ago, even, thousands or whatnot. And they would have Kava at the end of their day every single day. And they would appoint one person, normally a young person in the tribe or whatnot, that would actually sit, and they would have the Kava root, and they would chew it to release the Kava Lactones, and then they would spit into a large bowl of water. And they would chew it and then spit and then chew it and then spit until they got to therapeutic
Oh,
amounts.
damn.
And then all of the elders would drink from that,
I'm like,
right? That was the
health
thing.
codes, hello.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And
you're getting a D at that Kava bar.
so even today, even the indigenous cultures don't do that anymore. That
Right,
was like
right.
ancient time kind of things.
Right.
Because they figured out pretty quick that you had to release the Kava lactone. The Kava lactones are the active constituents in Kava. And, these Kava lactones are lipid-like compounds. It's a full complex of active constituents, right? A living complex of different synergistic constituents that together interface with your body and create these amazing effects. Just like cannabis, it's a full complex of cannabinoids and terpenes and all these different things, supportive constituents. It's not just one linear constituent with one linear mechanism.
Right, which is
the
the difference between a whole plant extract and a pharmaceutical.
Yeah, that's where the intelligence is. It's like your
Right.
body is also a complex system. And whenever you take in a complex system from, guess what, your natural environment, right, that's part of nature, which you are a part too, right, makes sense, right, that it has the ability in many cases to interface with your living system in a way that's biologically compatible, that the system doesn't say, whoa, and start shutting down systems and down-regulating it, which is the phenomenon that causes tolerance and addiction, withdrawal, and so on.
Also, the phenomenon that not only causes imbalances physiologically, but imbalances of power. When you look at pharmaceutical patents, right?
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
they take white willow bark, and there's something in there that works for pain, and then they make aspirin out of it.
Yeah.
And now aspirin, Bayer owns this thing, and now they control it.
It's always trying to extract the drug, the one compound, and that's
Right.
sort of the whole Western, view that so many of us now, and even in science, we're starting to realize and have been for a while that that's a mistake, right? Of looking for the thing, the drug that we can take out, isolate, synthesize, and patent, right? Which is basically ripping off nature, right? And then like trying to own something, right? And when you do that, it's not a living system anymore. Now you've taken it out of its living context, and it doesn't behave the same way at all, because it was in a complex, a synergistic complex of a bunch of other living constituents that kept its action in check, right? Like it may have other constituents that keep it from driving this action too much in the body or that action too much, right? And so this is why most medicinal herbs and plants, even the ones that are not so tonic that you can't use all the time, that can sort of knock you off your center. Cannabis can be in that wheelhouse a little bit, but it's nowhere near the type of consequences, not even the same ballpark of synthetic opiates, right? Or synthetic drugs really of any kind. And that's something that pretty much everybody agrees upon, right? It's like the cannabis is not. It's like like. Maybe it can knock you off your center, if you're on it too much, but, no one is dying from cannabis withdrawal, right? No one's crawling out of their skin, punching themselves. I mean, there may be, someone, but, emotional perspective or whatnot, but that's generally not the case.
When I used to not have weed, I would have temper tantrums, but
Right.
that's about as bad as it goes.
Right, exactly, yeah. You're not like actually sitting there convulsing,
Right.
And foaming at the mouth and,
Right.
these kind of things,
Which,
right?
what's interesting about withdrawal, I observed at one point in life multiple people going through withdrawals over the course of a couple weeks, and the worst withdrawal I've ever personally witnessed was from just alcohol alone.
Oh, yeah.
Convulsions,
Yeah.
paramedics,
Absolutely.
whole things.
Absolutely.
It's crazy.
Just like benzos, it's one of those that you can absolutely die from.
Isn't that crazy?
The withdrawal, yeah. And it's amazing, right?
I think a lot of people that haven't, that are fortunate enough not to have had that experience or been around that kind of thing don't realize, man, alcohol is hardcore.
Yeah.
It's a hardcore drug.
As far as
if it's abused, like
exactly,
everything.
right? Exactly. The double-edged sword, possibly, and and the type that you use maybe. But there's alcohol, benzodiazepines, opiates. Those are the ones that are just generally known as like the withdrawals being so bad that they can literally kill you. Stimulants, you crash and you're going through hell, right? If you're going through cocaine withdrawal or amphetamine withdrawal. And that's bad in its own way, but it's a little bit, different as far as like the lethality of it, So, so with plant medicine, right? So we talked about the complexity there and some of the differences. And so, the Kava Lactones, like I was saying, is a full complex of constituents. So the indigenous people would make this drink, And how they make it even today is they'll put it in like a, some sort of a strainer bag or like a coconut like cloth, and they'll still have the bowl of water, but they'll take it and they'll put some of the ground dry root in the bag and they'll put it down the water and they'll knead it and squeeze it out and wring it out like a towel, and then they'll dip it back and squeeze it out. And that pressure and that constant sort of maceration will release this oily complex undamaged into the cold water, right? So you're not using heat or anything like that. And then you have that full lactone complex, and it rises to the surface, and it's like shiny, like it's like an oily complex that sort of comes to the surface. So it's really a suspension, right? Like the Kava Lactones aren't water soluble, but
They're not.
Yeah, it's a suspension.
Oh, interesting.
But we think that there are other water soluble supportive constituents that are there in that mix too, in the batch and stuff. But yeah, so so you get the full lactone complex. And then whenever you drink it, and the indigenous people, know this. They know that that's real kava, and that's where you get these amazing effects. You actually get the best effects if you can get it fresh, if you can, get a fresh kava, because all the enzymes are there. It hasn't been dried through any other method or anything like that, and then you get, effects that can be quite profound, actually, that everybody is going to write home about that one. But, so, the traditional prep is that drink. And so I started experimenting with these things and having some of these suppliers, and I'm someone who's pretty resourceful and became even more so, right? Became even more so because it's easy to become resourceful whenever you're fighting for your life, right? It's like, and I was already kind of that way, but I was in absolute desperation mode, So yeah, so anyways, as I was, sort of vetting out supply for these things, and I was getting a lot of different kava materials, which came in the form of bags. They were like bags of this ground root powder, and then
I'm familiar.
They taught me, yeah, exactly, yeah. And a lot of people who go into this niche, who don't just buy the capsule off the shelf, have tried this,
Well, I did that because I would take I've looked up some of the data, and it has effects, positive effects, calms you down, good for sleep and anxiety and all the stuff that you described. But I take those 3 little stupid pills from Whole Foods. This does nothing.
And you're like,
I need more.
yeah,
So
cool.
then I would take a couple cups of the raw, or not raw, but the, I guess, powdered root, right? And then make a tea out of that, and it would make my whole head numb. And I thought, well, this is doing something.
No, exactly, yeah. Yeah, and so you do get something, even if it's not the best quality kava. It's still way better than what you get out of those capsules for a lot of reasons I'll explain. But there's so I was experimenting with a lot of different root materials, different strains, cultivars, just different types, which I didn't even know heads or tails at the time which ones, but I was learning this process of the different strains, where they came from and such.
How many different strains are there that are known?
There's over 100,
wow.
for sure, and even of the non, so desirable ones, even more than that, So there's a lot of different strains, and there's, so I was trying strain after strain after strain, literally dozens and dozens of different strains. And what I noticed right off the bat was, okay, this is definitely something, there's something here. But, the other thing about kava is that it elicits something that the indigenous people and, just kava drinkers in general call reverse tolerance. And this goes down to the unique pharmacology of kava, right, of plant medicine, which you don't get from a pharmaceutical like this, is that, how whenever you take a drug, you get the most prominent effect the first time you take it, and then it goes down from there because tolerance ensues, right? And it's never like that first time. Well, kava is really just the opposite. Like, the first time is usually the weakest, kava will ever feel, when you're taking this real kava, or, in its traditional context. Taking it over 2 weeks, the effects intensify even more, and it sort of integrates its way in your system, and it sort of builds up. And then taking it over a month, and especially 2 months, that's whenever where it's, that you're at the peak of what it's going to do for you, until it eventually, levels off. And it's actually kind of funny because in the scientific community, this is always known about kava, but it wasn't until, it's always been hypothesized that there was, and it's been looked at and such, and but it was always hypothesized that there was some GABA receptor upregulation going on, from that, because the more you took it over time, the less you even needed to get the same effects.
That is so weird.
It is, right. It's because of that complexity in the ways that we don't even understand exactly, how it's interfering, but it's doing something, we believe, that's modulating the receptors through this complex set of array of Kava Lactones. binding to the receptors and modulating them in such a way where it's sort of waking up the parasympathetic nervous system and supporting its rehabilitation.
That is
right?
so dope.
So,
God, I love plants. Plants are so
yeah,
cool.
Exactly. So we've
Wow.
seen some things, and there's been a lot of stuff, increasing GABA receptor density and such, and that's over long periods of time, or that's been proposed and so on. But so that's just something that Kava users know, and I figured out really, really quick from direct experience. Was like I started taking it, and it just totally blew the lid off of my expectations. Like honestly, like I was not expecting to get something like this from a plant outside of maybe cannabis or a psychedelic, like that level of power. And it was that perfect level because I didn't want something like cannabis or psychedelics that I was taking every day, right? And
Yeah.
I needed to be
Ayahuasca is not exactly a tonic herb.
not exactly one of those that you daily use. You might end up
maybe not even yearly.
Yeah, exactly. You may end up a little off the ground, to say the least. But anyways, as I started to build it up, it was like after taking some of these really good strains of Kava like once, I'm like, okay, yeah, there's something there. After 2 weeks, I'm like, oh, yeah, I really like this. And after a month and a half, I love this stuff. Like, I love this stuff because it was helping me so much in my situation, And within a very short amount of time, literally like 4 months, I was completely off of, of regular use of benzos,
Nice.
Being off of benzos after being on them for that period of time, being so hopelessly completely dependent on them, that was so powerful because everybody knows who's been through benzo withdrawal. It is one of the hardest drugs to get off of.
So you were still taking the benzos while you started to integrate the more refined,
yes, and I was
specific use of Kava.
because I couldn't go off the benzos. I had to layer in the Kava and get this sort of whatever is going on here, this upregulation and this and get to where I actually was comfortable, and then a slow taper off the benzos after that. That was my particular strategy. I'm not telling anybody else. I'm not, to do exactly what I did.
Legal disclaimer. The Lifestylist podcast does neither condone or endorse the use of I probably have to make one of those at some point because I get so excited. I'm like, everyone do this.
I know, exactly.
I'm like, wait, can you do that?
It's not meant to treat, prevent, cure, all those things. Yeah. I mean, for sure, because it's one of those things that doing anything you want to be working with a professional, and a physician and whatnot who knows what they're doing, maybe hard to find, but yes. So, there are, and so that was my experience with it, and I was just totally blown away by the effects. And not to mention, on top of that, because of the state that my brain was in, I also was getting all of these side benefits. Like the benzos would actually muddle my brain chemistry, even though they were helping, and they would obviously the memory loss and things we talked about before, and were making me, I was feeling dumber and dumber as time was going on. And I got this amazing nootropic effect as I started to build up therapeutic levels of this real Kava in my system. And certain strains more than others, because some strains, kind of like cannabis, if people have been into that world and of medical cannabis or whatnot, there are some strains that are more nighttime strains that are more like immediately, sedative. And there are some strains that are more daytime strains that are more like nootropic and mood lifting and such. All of Kava reduces anxiety, but those ones that are daytime elicit more of like a calm focus, but not sedation.
Oh, interesting.
So it for me, I use different strains at different times, and I was getting like this perfect nootropic effect to turn my brain on whenever it wasn't working. And more than anything, and I had experimented with every possible nootropic and stacks and all kinds of other things, and I still love a lot of nootropics and a lot of nootropic stacks out there and stacking different things and cycling different things and such, but I don't know if I've come across anything that helped me as much from a nootropic standpoint as Kava, and that was not something I was expecting at all.
I've never heard that either.
It's something that's starting to be written about by certain select people, and it's because most people are trying the capsules, right?
Yeah.
The effects are totally gone out of the capsules.
Or getting, I don't want to shoot my supplier in the foot, but I have ordered my Kava root from what I think is a pretty reputable company, and when I mentioned it to you, you were like, yeah, I know the strain they use and it's whack. I'm like, I mean, it does something, but it doesn't do what you're describing. I definitely didn't have any like cognitive benefit. I think it helped me with sleep a little bit here and there, but I would never consider it like in my mainstay wheelhouse of like, this is my go-to for anxiety or sleep. Or,
and a lot of times it's just
cognition.
like medical cannabis. It's like dialing it in the right strain that really gels with you. One may not so much and one may be perfect, but most of it is the quality of the kava, how it was grown, how long it was grown, and then certainly how it was extracted, and if it was extracted, and how it was then stored and stabilized and so on. And then the dosages and everything like that too. So I got all these amazing side benefits from it, and it was like one of those things where I just became like obsessed with it. Clearly, because it helped me so much. And around this time, so it allowed me to basically start tolerating a lot of things that were aggressive that needed to be done, like detox. And that sort of brings us back to that whole thing, of like I started to be able to implement other supplements, without being able to tolerate foods, be able to tolerate deeper nutrition, be able to tolerate different therapies, treatments, modalities that I would react to badly before. It was that leverage over my system. It sort of like was a safe crutch, right? It's like I needed a crutch for a period of time. It was like a safe crutch that was also appeared to be contributing to my healing process too. So it's like it wasn't the one thing, but it was an amazing tool for me. So I was actually able to integrate a lot of these other things, and I was actually able to just actually start to turn the tide and just very slowly get better and better and better. And I had mentioned working with Dr. Pompa and such, and it played such a crucial role. Why I keep mentioning him, in this whole thing and coaching me through a lot of these different strategies. I've learned so much from him. Cut 2 years later, and I was almost a totally different person, not 100% well yet, but was like, functional. And I actually started working with Dr. Pompa and his group of, functional medicine doctors, doing some research for them and doing some, some product development stuff and some different things. And one thing that I had brought to him, actually, even before we started actually working together officially, was the Kava. I mean, because he was actually coaching me during this time, and he saw this massive thing. Like, he was like about to throw his hand. He was like seriously like, distraught about this, where we were, because we couldn't get anywhere. And he saw what it did for me, and then I was like, hey, let's, we should try this on some other people. He's like, yeah, we got to try it on my other clients. So whenever we started working together, I started, talking to the other clients, and we started providing them with the means of trying it themselves on their own dime, to try to do this. And I sort of was just giving them my experience, and sort of, people who were desperate in the same way. And we just saw so many amazing results with it. And I had talked to so many people, literally in the hundreds, or more than that, even since then, that I've personally talked to and seen people implement it for their own purposes to transition off of benzodiazepines, or to use as a safe nootropic if they're just like a biohacker, they're just someone, that's like trying to hack sleep. We have like an army of doctors in our group here, that all have Aura rings, that are all trying this product, and they see the results on deep sleep too, because it enhances deep sleep. As where a benzodiazepine will put you to sleep, but it'll mess up REM sleep. So it's like all these amazing, things. So as you well know, if you can improve your REM cycles, you can improve just about everything, at least to some degree, And like the daytime strains, they still will help with REM sleep, even though they don't, put you to sleep. If it's in your system, like, I tended to get better sleep that night, lead to a good sleep kind of thing. So the main benefits that I was seeing are all the main ones. So you've got the anti-anxiety effects, the anticonvulsant effects that I was seeing from it. Personally, the antidepressant effects that I was seeing from it, the nootropic effects, which were huge. And then as I started, I've read every piece of, literature available, ever done on Kava, from every word.
Sounds like it.
And, it's been, different forms of Kava in, traditional forms too, et cetera, have been studied for many more applications. I actually used it, some other side benefits. While I had mentioned that I was doing a lot of fasting and keto adaptation, and for someone who's as sick as me, it was hard to adapt. It was actually the most effective supplement for helping and assisting keto adaptation, because it's a big appetite suppressant, first of all. And secondly, as I started to dig into the literature, there are several studies that have come out in the last few years establishing mechanisms through which Kava enhances a process called autophagy in the body by activating this pathway called AMPK and suppressing mTOR. So basically activating your body into a recycle mode where it recycles its own body fat and bad tissues for energy to survive, and taking you out of that growth mode. And again, this is actually leading to one of the other things that Kava has been thoroughly studied for, and where most of the excitement is right now in the ethnobotanical sort of scientific world. is some studies, not making any claims here, just talking about the studies, is studies, with Kava and cancer and metabolic disorders. There are certain people in the scientific community who I'm spoken to who believe that, Kava might be a more powerful aid, supportive aid, as a preventative and, tool in the whole cancer paradigm as cannabis, or maybe even more so. And this is actually, there's a lot of data behind this, and of course we need more, and it's just, it's an interesting thing to talk about. I'm not saying that it's, but we have mechanisms, and in that topic, the interest of the scientific community was actually originally peaked back in the early 2000s. It was just an observation that kava drinking countries where people were drinking kava, like a huge percentage of the population, like some of these islands that were drinking kava on a regular basis and also using high amounts of tobacco, had ridiculously low levels of lung cancer, right? That was just kind of an interesting thing. And so an epidemiological study was carried out where they looked at all of these countries in the South Pacific, and they were trying to, create a correlation and look at, cancer incidences in comparison to kava consumption. And without fail, it was a direct inverse relationship between kava consumption and cancer incidences. As kava consumption went up, cancer incidences went down, without exception, across all 8 countries that were studied.
Wow.
So that was it's and of course it's epidemiological and stuff, but that piqued the interest of the scientific community. And so kava has actually since then been rigorously studied to establish mechanisms and look into this, even though it hasn't really penetrated into
I've never
the
heard
world
anything about that.
but there's it's actually one of the most studied herbs in the world, and a lot of these studies are looking at compounds like certain Kava Lactones and other chalcones that might be responsible and linked to this supportive effect against processes in the body like this. Like a study came out that was looking at a Kava Lactone, one of the Kava Lactones called yangonin, and showed that it was a powerful mTOR suppressor, AMPK activator, right? So again, autophagy is how the body recycles and gets rid of old damaged cell components, which is what makes fasting so amazing, because the body eats from itself when it stops eating externally, and which is why a lot of people, Walter Longo's work and such has created a lot of hype around fasting and such. And that's essentially what Kava appears to be doing, is assisting the body into that recycle mode and out of that growth mode, right? Through various mechanisms, which is hence the appetite suppression. It's affecting hormones and that whole pathway and so on. All of these side benefits that were eventually fleshed out whenever I really started to go down this rabbit hole of research too, and it just had all these amazing effects. And rarely do you come across something with that has this much perceived benefit with this little drawbacks, right? And which actually leads us to something that we absolutely have to touch on, because I say this little drawbacks, and a lot of people who have gone somewhat down the Kava rabbit hole have said, what about Kava and liver function?
Oh,
right?
I have heard that. Yeah,
Kava and liver function.
That it's hard on your liver.
That it's hard on
like
your
that.
liver, which is actually anyone researching Kava. Actually, it's starting to change rapidly. It's closer to half and half now of the data of the articles that are floating out there of people that are still under the old paradigm of saying that it's damaging to your liver and whatnot. And actually, probably, it requires a little explanation here. Those whole liver toxicity or liver, dampening claims all originated from a series of analysis that took place in Germany and Switzerland in the early 2000s, 2000 to 2002. Essentially, it all originated from one pharmaceutical company. I'm not going to, I won't name the name.
The one who sells the most diazepams.
Well, actually,
it
wasn't. It was a European, but so it was one pharmaceutical company, and it was one pharmaceutical product. And all of these claims, this whole belief system that has just been pervasive around the world, it's just like stuck and just grown, just sort of like a lot of the things that have stuck to cannabis, all literally comes from this one situation. So it was this one pharmaceutical company that was trying to create a drug out of kava, because there started to be a big kava boom once people started to realize what it was in the West, like in the late 90s. and then pharma companies were racing to it, and this company was trying to make a drug out of it. They were going around and buying up kava material, and again, lack of understanding of indigenous, concepts and things around plant medicine and such. They were just trying to extract the drug, like we were talking about. They were just looking, so they dug in the literature, and they were looking for Kava Lactones. Like, we're going to get the Kava Lactones out of there. And so they weren't paying any attention to, like, what parts of the plant were being used and so on in most cases. And this is what's now what the general perspective on this whole situation is. So they were going around and just buying kava material from people in Vanuatu and other places, and just buying it and such. And the problem with that is that at that time, when there was a big kava boom and kava was starting to become more valuable, there, of course, like in anything, there were unscrupulous exporters and farmers in these islands that would want to sell everything. And just a fact about kava is that the only consumable parts of the plant, all that drink and everything that we just talked about, is all made out of the roots of the plant. So many plants out there in nature, rhubarb, for example, there are parts of the plant that you make a nice pie out of, right? And then other parts are very toxic, actually. You can't consume them. There are many plants in nature, all throughout nature, that you can consume certain parts of the plants and not others. So anyways, at this time, there were a lot of exporters in places like Vanuatu and other places that were selling their waste products, which are above ground aerial parts of the plant, leaves and stems, because they contain Kava Lactones, but they also contain plant defense alkaloids that are toxic to humans. And the indigenous people knew this a long time ago, hundreds of years ago, had figured out, because they ate them and got sick, right? And so they've known this, and traditionally nobody consumes, the anything but the roots and the basal stump that just comes above the ground. But they were just looking for Kava Lactones and such, and so that was the situation. So they basically ended up with a confounding situation where it's believed now that it was totally a quality control issue, meaning that they either ended up with aerial parts, and they were doing extraction methods with aggressive solvents that then concentrated those compounds that are not only questionable, but we know are toxic, at least, to some degree. And on top of that, a lot of the exporters at this time were trying to increase their profits and the weight of their batches, so they weren't dehydrating them. And like in most tropical plants, that means mold, which means mycotoxins.
That's always my concern with something that's made from a root.
Yeah.
Anything
exactly.
Growing underground that's wet.
Exactly.
That's one of the main issues with peanuts.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just like you're harvesting something
and
out of wet soil.
And it's a big problem, yeah. You've got a tropical plant, that's is full of water. I mean, you're going to have mold and you're going to have mycotoxins and so on. So, between mycotoxins, between hidden aerial parts and these toxic alkaloids, and, sorry, the other thing that is important too is that there are, we mentioned that there are hundreds of cultivars of kava, there's a certain class of kava that are known as by the indigenous people of Vanuatu and these other places as daily drinkers. So these are basically the cultivars of kava that the indigenous people have selected for over thousands of years for characteristics that are tolerable daily. And whenever we look at them scientifically, we find that they actually knew what they were doing, because they actually all fit these daily drink kavas, also known as noble kavas. That's sort of a classification term for a class of cultivars that meet a certain chemical profile, a certain composition profile, that have a certain ratio type of Kava Lactones, that have very low amounts of certain other constituents that are hard to digest, or actually, most of these noble Kava varieties have none at all of these other compounds called flavocavines, these little chalcones that are more suspect. We don't know that they're toxic like the alkaloids in the aerial parts of the plant. The alkaloid that we know is toxic, called pipermethysstine. So there's some questionable things. We know that they can cause negative symptoms, these non-noble kavas, right, in a lot of people, which is why they don't drink them daily, is that they can cause stomach ache. They're very hard to process sometimes. They can actually cause a little bit of a hangover, not because of the effects on the brain with the Kava Lactones, but because of these other compounds that are in it, which is why they've selected for characteristics to tone down and have this class of cultivars over thousands of years that they can drink daily. And then some of these other kavas that are more aggressive, they use only acutely for acute medicinal things because they can kick even harder than some of the noble kavas, But in this situation, less is usually more. Smooth is the name of the game with consistent kava use. But anyways, all of these things combined, all these quality control issues combined in the situation in Germany, they paid no never mind to assessing for strain, and especially trying to get these kavas that the indigenous people know are safe because they've been drinking them for 3,000 years every single day with virtually no reports of any instances of problems, especially on any kind of a level that's worth writing home about, right? Anything on an epidemic level, associated with these daily drink kavas. So anyways, they didn't pay any never mind to these things, and so it was, between, toxic aerial parts through low quality, kava material, non-noble varieties, so just other kava strains that aren't even ever consumed or rarely consumed by indigenous peoples, mold, mycotoxins, and other, forms of contamination. And then extraction with solvents that's taking the plant out of its context and basically turning into a drug by isolating. It's like taking the caffeine out of coffee and putting it into a pill. Some people go to the ER off of that, but very few people will go to the ER off of drinking coffee,
Right.
So it's that kind of a thing. Like, you can't take caffeine out of coffee and call it coffee. You can't buy a caffeine pill and call it coffee, right? Some of these solvent extracts, you can't call them kava because kava is this drink, this full spectrum drink that they've been drinking safely for very, very many years. So basically how this was all vetted out was there was this huge investigation, both in the scientific community and brought before the German administrative courts and such, trying to figure out this enigma. Like, how have these people, because it just didn't make sense. It didn't make sense to scientists, researchers. It didn't make sense to anybody, because here's a drink that's been drank daily for 3,000 years with no problems. One pharma company comes off, makes an extract, hurts even, like 20 to 50 people or total in the whole history or such. And now, kava causes liver failure or it's toxic and these kind of things, and which is actually why the FDA never banned it. Because following that situation, because they're a pharma company, they got a lot of press around it. So a lot of attention. They created this huge buzz about it, over in Germany. And several countries across the world banned kava all at once. You had, Germany did it, Australia did it, Canada did it. There are several places that actually banned it, not because of its like addictive nature or anything like that, but because of these potentially damaging effects on the liver. So there's this freak out, like regulatory agencies oftentimes can end up in. But FDA never banned it because they sort of realized, like, this doesn't make sense. But they did issue a disclaimer, like, you may want to be careful. But they even never banned it. And actually, the majority of countries never did. It was just sort of one of those things where no one knew for sure. Indigenous peoples knew that something had run amok, But anyways, it had been investigated over literally like the last 15 to 20 years. So much, literature had been done, and even since then, traditional preparations of kava have never produced any cytotoxicity, any hepatotoxicity, they call it, liver toxicity whatsoever in cell cultures. When you talk about traditional preparations of noble kava varieties, right? Not isolates of certain things and so on, that has never been reproduced. So that was one of those things, right? So it's, so basically it had been vetted out like this for many years. And eventually, a few years ago, around 2015, the World Health Organization finally issued, a statement after assessing this whole thing. Like, and the statement literally was quoted, and I believe we have it on our website. But that kava's been used, has at least a 1,500-year history of use in most of these islands. And traditional preparations of kava are seen are relatively safe for human consumption, or are safe for human consumption if you do these certain things, right? That this was most likely absolutely a quality control issue. And actually, it's gone so far now to the point that they're, World Health Organization and the Codex Alimentarius Committee, which is, works alongside them to sort of set world quality standards, is in the midst of looking at adopting, a world quality standard for kava to differentiate these two things. FDA is looking at this too, because it's one of those things that it's ridiculous. It's just like the whole marijuana hemp thing. Just, we all know that CBD is not the same thing as marijuana, but yet it takes a while for legislators to to figure this out, and and make these distinctions, right? It's like the difference between noble traditional kava preparations and solvent extracts of some of these aggressive varieties, these funky varieties, is as different as marijuana to CBD. You know,
Right.
It's so different.
When you were starting to explore the different strains and preparations and stuff, did you actually have to physically go travel to these different islands in the South Pacific, or were you ordering off janky little websites or a private supplier on Etsy?
Yeah, you know, so it was one of those
how are you
things
finding it when it wasn't a capsule from Whole Foods?
Yeah, exactly. So we had to vet
nothing?
these things out, and a lot of this information comes from, boots on the ground, especially through, friends of mine who I've, gotten to know very well, who have actually spent years on the ground there, and can make, like in all of these, and have developed deep relationships with, people in Vanuatu, in Fiji, and, people who we're now, sourcing with and sourcing from, who have deep relationships and have, supply chains where there's rigorous quality control of only growing individual strains, not a hodgepodge of a lot of different strains together, which is actually what most kava is.
Right. That's what we were talking about that earlier with the stuff I was buying. You're like, yeah it's maybe 2% of the noble
So
strains.
most of those, even those not so good. Well, let's talk about this first real quick, because we still haven't really addressed what makes kava not as good whenever you extract it like they extract it in a capsule. All of those capsule products are mostly extracted with solvents, like alcohol.
Hexane or...
some chemical solvents.
The worst,
but
right?
Yeah, and acetone and such. But, but most of them out there are alcohol extracts.
Okay.
Some CO2 extracts, too. CO2 and alcohol extractions are good for some plants if they have one or two active compounds or most active compounds, or if they're mostly alcohol soluble or whatnot. But for kava, not so good at all, right? It kills basically all the effects whenever you do it.
Shit.
And the reason is because it only grabs certain things and it leaves a whole host of others. So you've totally divorced the whole living system, right, that we were talking about earlier. So now the system, they can't all work together anymore. Now you've just taken a couple guys out, a couple little active compounds out.
This is true of a lot of herbs, like chaga, for example. I for years I've been boiling, these huge crock pots of chaga, and then my friend Daniel Vitalis, who's really into medicinal mushrooms, he's like, that's great, good for you, but you're missing the oil. Was it the oil soluble?
Or the alcohol soluble.
Yeah, alcohol soluble. He's like, yeah, I mean, it's not going to hurt you, but you're missing a lot of the...
Missing a lot of the goodies there,
and
they
so
do
I'm
dual
like,
extractions.
Man. And so I think what he does just at home is he'll do a water extract, then take the chunks that are left over and then soak them forever in alcohol.
Oh, exactly. They'll do an alcohol. They'll do a dual extraction.
Right.
So they'll extract it in two ways. So you get, and then they'll mix it together.
Yeah.
They'll dry it into all one powder and concentrate it and so on. Yeah.
So if you're doing, you have a, it's not the kava then is not water soluble. But if you use other solvents to get it out, you ruin it. So what's the
exactly? Yeah.
What's the solution that you arrived at to get all the chronic stuff out without ruining it?
So you have to extract it in some way that's mimicking its the natural preparation, right?
Right.
And so using,
which you described as kind of having the little nut milk bag type.
Yes, exactly.
Cloth and
so
a human being.
You have to pull
them
them out either through some form of pressure or so on, or through a method that's using water to help flush them out, but then also using pressure. So you're not damaging anything. You're not just grabbing one thing. That you're releasing them from the encased plant material in their full sort of matrix, so that their plant, Kava Lactone complex, right, as we call it, and to where that everything is there. And that's that's difficult to do, because a lot of methods, if you want to put it into a product that's ready to go, it's hard to do that without damaging the constituents. Like using pressure usually involves high heat, usually involves grinding these things that pull oxygen down into the oils and so on.
So is this why seed oils typically suck, because there's there's friction in a press, right?
Exactly.
If you're using pressure, there's friction in that, which creates heat.
Even most cold quote unquote cold pressed methods today, right? You go to the to the store and you see cold pressed seed oil and so on and so forth. And a lot of these companies, they're totally damaged, rancid oils. They call cold pressed like 110 degrees or more, where you start to get damage, right? Especially these polyunsaturated fats and so on, if you're talking about seed oils. So you've got to be able to integrate some method that is like literally down in the 90, 80 something degrees mark, and that doesn't use the traditional sort of expeller press type of thing where you're grinding, which pulls oxygen down into the oil, because a lot of these oils are very fragile. They'll oxidize, and so you turn a medicine or a medicinal food into an inflammatory nightmare, with seed oils, And, this was something that is a factor, too, when you talk about, because the Kava Lactone complex, like I said, is an oil complex. So you've got that, So there's a lot there. But, so we got to a point, basically where we had to, just to finish up on the liver toxicity thing real quick. So basically, there's this process or this movement to make these very clear distinctions, now in real kava, like the stuff that's actually consumed and highly prized, and like other material that's out there and stuff too. And these, one of the problems too with like sourcing kava, and like I was saying with most of the products that were out there, most of the products, there are even these solvent extracts that end up really weak, actually are coming from kava that may not even be so safe, because we have personally tested almost every kava product out there on the market, or the sources of all them, because I've met most of the suppliers. There's really 5 or 6 large-scale exporters in Vanuatu, and they supply most of the world's kava because it's the biggest exporter in the world.
Are the indigenous peoples where this is being harvested stoked? Are they getting a good deal? I'm kind of just taking a sidetrack here. Is it helping those communities because they're like, whoa, shit, this stuff's really easy to grow and we know how to do it right, and now there's this demand for it?
Well, there's sort of there's these two camps, right? There's camps of people that, so one reason why everyone doesn't just grow noble kava is because these more wild-like kavas that are not as toned down and not as smooth, it's in a class of kava called 2-day, so they're basically closer to wild kavas and more aggressive and such. And there may be an application. We're not even saying that we know that they're toxic, but we know that in many cases they can cause negative symptoms, bad for kava's reputation. So you just have to know what you're getting. We just want people to be able to know whether you're getting noble kava or not. But in the islands, so 2-day kava, non-noble kavas grow much faster, so you can increase your yields drastically by growing these sort of not as smooth.
Swag.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it.
So by growing some of these other varieties of kava, you can increase your yields drastically. So they're planting a lot of these things, certain farmers, because they're trying to make money, and if there's a demand for it, they do it. But there is a portion of the community in these places that knows that long term this is bad for kava's reputation, because you create negative symptoms. It further hurts an already damaged reputation that is just now finally getting its second day, right? Getting its second chance. And a lot of the communities in these islands are saying, no, we have to implement these quality control measures because it's going to hurt kava's reputation again. When those kava bans happened originally, this hurt the economies in those islands because that is basically like their main export. One of their main exports in Vanuatu is kava.
Because these are tiny islands too.
Yeah,
right?
And so it's a big part of their culture and a big part of their whole economic situation down there.
Are the farmers incentivized to grow the really, the safe and most effective noble
Those
strains?
are the
Can they get more money for that than the swag 2-day stuff that you can just pop up more
up
more
until
bulk weight out?
Up until now, since there hasn't been, so after this whole thing happened with the stuff in Europe and stuff, Vanuatu actually acted very quickly, and they passed what's called the Kava Act of 2002 in their country, which actually restricted the export of all non-noble kava varieties and aerial parts and all of these things. But there wasn't much policing of it, and hasn't been. It's like, how do you police it? There are all these farmers, and people go to them. And it restricted the export of it if someone didn't ask for it. If someone asked for other strains, right, then you could export those. But you couldn't do it unknowingly and tell them that it's noble and such, because then they go around saying it's noble, and then people can possibly have side effects, and then that hurts all of kava's reputation. Like, they wanted it to be separated. So it's like, okay, if you have side effects, that's not all kava that the side effects. It's like, that's those kavas, right?
Could you take some kava seeds and go grow them in Florida or?
No, no, not without some sort of serious strat, because it takes 4 years minimum to grow a kava plant into maturity, and preferably if you can grow it the longer, the better.
Are they renewable? Can you? Oh no, because you're taking the roots. So once you pull it, you're
taking the roots, and kava Piper methysticum is actually cultivated kava that's been, domesticated to some degree to tone down to where humans can consume it regularly and such. So these noble varieties they don't produce seeds anymore. So its wild progenitor is actually a totally different species called Piper weishmanii. And it does produce seeds, but it is virtually unconsumable. I mean, it can make you violently sick, which is actually why the indigenous peoples, they discovered wild kava. This is how we think the story went. They discovered wild kava. They drank it, got all these good effects, but also got very sick by drinking it constantly, and it was so hard on their system that they started selecting for the more toned down, expressions of the plant, and over many generations selecting for the characteristics that they wanted to, replanting, until finally they ended up with these very, very dialed in strains that you could consume regularly, and those are what we call noble kavas today.
Wow, that's so interesting. I love
And so
this
each
stuff.
island, though, has a little bit different effects. So we talk about some of the more daytime, some of the more nighttime. That's because each island over those millennia or over those hundreds of years or thousands selected for the characteristics that they sought out most or wanted the most. Like if they wanted it for social gatherings, they'd select for those characteristics. Like in Tonga, that's the case. So in Tonga, they have more sort of euphoric, nootropic, socially enhancement kava. Even though all kava has those characteristics to some degree, they express that way more. So people go after Tongan varieties for that. And Vanuatu is sort of a wheelhouse. It's really balanced around that kind of thing. And then some are more on the sedative side of things, So it's really interesting at that, but they all ended up with these class, because eventually it just happened in all these islands that they toned them down to a point where they have this class of kavas that you can consume regularly, And actually, once we, like I was saying earlier, once we analyze them under the microscope, we know that they lack these compounds that we know are questionable, right? These flavocavines, and they certainly lack the compounds that we know are bad, like the plant alkaloids, the defense proteins, So it was, so that whole, that whole situation where they, so these islands, they have, individuals have like a monetary, like short-term incentive to grow these 2-day varieties, even though it's prohibited by law. But a lot of them are still doing it. And now it's getting to a point where kava is enough of a commodity, enough of a valuable thing where they're trying to put together and put into place more policing of a lot of these things. And because they know that people are going to want that because of the world quality standards and things and some of the standards that regulatory agencies are getting behind and everything of all the quality things that I just named, that people are going to be demanding that and testing for it. So they're not going to be able to, get away with doing that anymore if that's what they're engaged in right now.
Sweet.
So it's one of those things, yeah.
And that creates inevitably a win-win because the farmers that have integrity and are doing it right are getting top dollar for the commodity that they're producing and
look,
exporting.
It's like we don't even want to – we were talking about some of the cancer studies. Some of the apoptotic effects, outside of the autophagy-inducing effects, apoptotic effects actually come from those compounds that we think are questionable, the flavocavines. So we know that they're actually quite toxic to cancer cells. The question is like, what are the dosages and are they toxic to human cells or not? And those are the ones that are in the non-noble varieties and such. And so, which would mean like what the indigenous people said is like these could be useful for acute medicinal purposes, but dosage is key and such. So we're not even saying that there's not potentially an application for non-noble kava varieties, but it needs to be studied more. And we need to know exactly, and we need to know. Because the ones that we can say with a very good amount of confidence, and especially where regulatory agencies are heading with it now, that the noble kava varieties are the ones that we're good with, right? And then we can explore these others too and see where they fit, like acute medicinal or what, to add that extra this or that for acute situations. But we need to know what we're getting, right? So we don't want to necessarily just ban all other ones. It needs to be studied more. We need to know more about it,
So when I'm walking around today, Cameron, and I walked by and saw your booth, and I saw the roots, and then I saw something on the bottle about kava. I was like, I love kava, but I know that I have not tapped into its full potential. There's something there, and I get it, and I intuitively sense it, but I've also known, like, I don't know what the right stuff is. And then whatever your tincture preparation was, I think I had a 5 times recommended dose because your guy was like, oh, here, have a teaspoon. I was like, keep it coming, bartender.
Right.
And I had quite a lot, and I feel really good. Not at all sedated not like mood altering at all, but feeling really good, and I haven't barely eaten anything today. So bring us up in the interest of time, because I could go on. I love the nuances and like the details of everything, but so that we can tie a bow on it relatively soon. Bring me up to the point where you're going, shit, I think I know how to make a really great best in show product here and bring it to market. What was the initial decision to do that, to discovery, and maybe a summarized version of the journey of your R&D to bring the product that I just had and love downstairs to market?
Yeah, no, exactly. And we already touched on a few of those things, right? As far as like, going more towards using pressure and not solvents and those kind of things. And I knew that was going to be the case. And, when we were, originally testing these things out, and, Dr. Pompa and I, and we were, we knew that's like that if I was going to, develop a Kava product, that it had to be palatable for daily use. And if we were going to reach a lot of people, if we were going to reach the masses, if we were going to reach, the average person with it to get these therapeutic effects, it had to be palatable and it had to be easy, because the two, sort of caveats, or the two, difficulties, two main deterrents of traditional Kava are the preparation, number one, because it takes like 30 minutes to prepare this stuff and it's really messy. And then the taste, and the taste, because you end up with something that looks very much like muddy water. And it doesn't taste like great, and some people think it's quite nasty. But the thing is that people love the effects so much they go to it. But the cumulative effects that we were talking about, a lot of times they taste it once and they don't drink it long enough to get to that month where they're like, oh, that's what it is, right? And so a lot of times they don't even give it enough of a chance. And even if they do love it, especially if they're sick or challenged and if they have gastrointestinal stuff, it's like, people don't necessarily, the average person doesn't necessarily like to drink that dirty water with all of those plant pieces in it floating around in it. It's like sediment, and it's like, so I knew I really wanted to create something that captures the effects of traditional Kava and something that's ready to use, that a person who is challenged can use, or just a person who wants to go, take it on the go, all that stuff, so we knew we had to do that. And, we experimented with a lot of different, methodologies and stuff. And we've got a lot of people that we work with, and I get my hands in there, and I, with, different extraction methods and stabilizing and all kinds of things. We've got some brilliant people on our team that, help us in product development too. But it was a team effort for everybody involved. And I sort of put all the pieces together. So we developed a method that involves, pressure at very, very low temperatures. Less than 90 degrees, no grinding in it whatsoever, so no oxygen is being pulled into the oil. And then we process it with a type of seed oil that doesn't get damaged during this process, which is a sunflower seed oil. And the lecithin content acts as a carrier for the lactones, because the lactones are lipid-like compounds. Yeah, too. So
wow, interesting.
That's the thing. And a thing that I also discovered later on is that, something else, another little, tidbit is that both MCT and caffeine both intensify the effects of Kava and increase the absorption quite rapidly.
Really? That's what, when I tried it and you told me that it was sunflower oil, I had the thought, and I was going to ask you, well, I wonder why you didn't use MCT, because it's a very neutral, good carrier oil.
And the main reason is because we're processing the seeds along with the process, and MCT is already like ready to go, and we're probably eventually. I mean, I'm telling people that right now we'll probably eventually have a product with MCT in it, but that's just the thing. Especially like I've found that the pure caprylic acid, like those really good MCTs, like seem to work
stuff?
very, very good. Yeah, exactly. So a lot of those work very, very well. You don't necessarily want to take it with caffeine if you're taking it for anxiety, though, and if you have,
Yeah.
But if you're using it as a nootropic, though, then definitely nootropic.
So
stack.
one could take your oils, because also with the sunflower oil, you have the emulsification properties of some sunflower lecithin in there,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So it could be a dope stack in a bulletproof style coffee.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's very
and absolutely is, and that's what I use it for. We do all kinds of stacks, and we're
yeah.
it's amazing because it's an oil. you can actually put it in a bulletproof style coffee. You can put it in basically anything that you would put oils on. You can put it on salads. You know, you can put it on. You can have your Kava oil on salads and stuff too. And what we found too is that after lab analysis, we run everything through HPLC like lab analysis, and we've gotten a very, very close comparable what's called a chemotype. So that is like it's like a 6-digit number sequence that shows, you know, the ratios of all the primary Kava lactones. So that's like the fingerprint of what it's like traditionally, and then you compare it afterwards, you know, just to see if what you have has been denatured or not.
Oh,
so
cool.
every bit is run through that process.
Wow.
Along with we rigorously test every batch that comes in, both before and after it comes into the States, for both biological and industrial contaminants. So down to the subpart per billion level with heavy metals, with pesticides, with all that stuff, and then through bacteria, because in some of these places where they grow without chemicals, like Vanuatu, there's a biological contaminant, and a lot of the Kava out there is contaminated not only with mycotoxins but also bacteria like E. coli. We've found a lot of those.
Dude, I bet
types
because
of things.
they're using irrigation water where there's livestock.
They're using the creeks and streams and stuff like that where it's that, and then there's animals grazing on the land, and they're crapping on everything and such. And you know, so not only do you have all these non-noble varieties and just sort of this thing, is these large-scale operations are just we've tested most of the Kava out there and did not come even anywhere close to our quality standards. So you know, purity and potency, right, is just like my number one. Like I've been sick. Like my goal was to make the highest quality products possible, and then let the price, you know, be what it needs to be, and then maybe try to, you know, make something that's economical that still meets the standards, you know, in the future or whatnot. But you know, it's got to be clean, it's got to be safe. So everything is 100% certified noble Kava. We've tested it, you know, to look at the chemotypes and such, like I explained. We tested for everything, including mycotoxins, which no one is doing with Kava, which is an extra expense, but I think that it's an extremely important one, you know, just to ensure that it's the cleanest Kava product possible. Yeah, and we have a few other products, too, that we're dealing with. You know, one of our, you know, guys who's our supplier, you know, one of our suppliers who we work with, who's a good friend of mine at this point. We're in the process of developing some shelf-stable drinks that are even more potent.
Rad. With the more sedative effects.
Well, with all different, because there'll be different strains.
Oh,
you
cool,
know? So
cool.
that's what we like. That's what we're in the midst
See
of
how
trying
I do that there? I just go right to the sedative.
Right. Exactly, yeah. Well, and the thing about this oil is that it has all the effects, the effects profile, the depth of traditional Kava, but it's in a concentration and in a form that is for daily practical tonic use. So it's not too potent to where it can be distracting or anything like that. So you can take it any time of the day type of thing.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about kratom, or as some people refer to it that aren't woke, kratom. And I love that compound. It's a ground up leaf. I mean, it's minimally processed to my understanding. And it's great once in a while at the right dose. But if you take kratom too often and too much, in my own subjective experience, it can make you feel really nauseous, groggy, kind of high, but not in a good way.
Yeah.
It's gnarly. And so I like it, but I always treat it, well, not always, because I have made mistakes with kratom, but I'm much more conscious about it now that I realize
right.
there's a certain tipping point there where you're like, God, this does not feel good. And it's not something I would recommend anyone do in a tonic
exactly.
herb capacity.
And that's actually an interesting quick point there, because a lot of times, a lot of these sort of, legal compounds, plant compounds that affect brain chemistry or affect mood in any way or such, all get sort of lumped in together, and you find them at head shops and stuff like that. Or
like the Kava bar that has kratom and Kava and da-da-da, you know.
And a lot of these different things, and it's one of these things that, you know, first of all, we've talked about the quality issues, and any situation like that is most likely going to have a form of Kava that doesn't represent all the things that we just talked about.
I get that sense,
exactly,
man. And that sucks, because every once in a while I do pass by one of those little plant medicine bars, and I'm like, ooh, God, I've never gone into one, but I think, oh, man, I like Kava. Maybe they have a really great brew and they're doing it right, but if it's got, you know, ox poop in it from freaking Sri Lanka or wherever.
And it's just, it may be one of these strains, or it could be not 100% root material, and it could be one of those things that's not so good for your system to be consuming
Right.
regularly, right? And the mycotoxin thing is a huge thing too, obviously, you know. But I mean, anyways, even if it was good kava, a lot of times a lot of these get lumped in together, and like things like kava and kratom are very different. Like kratom has its place. Like kratom is one of those, but it's not a tonic situation. Like kratom is one of those things great for, you know, people are using it to taper off of opiates, just like, you know, people are using kava for benzos and alcohol, and kava can be good for others too. Helpful for others, but, you know, probably the best for those two because it binds the same receptors. But you know, kratom is one of those more like acutely medicinal, because there is some habituation there, you know, to some of it. You know, but you just have to, use it in that context. You use it
Agreed.
too much. The addiction is not much worse than like coffee addiction, but it's still, you know,
Yeah.
something that needs to be taken care of.
Yeah.
So just some quick differentiation.
Well, I
on that point.
appreciate that, because I am
Yeah.
an advocate for the use of plants for all types of different things, but some of them do need a little bit of a disclaimer, and kratom
Yeah.
would definitely be one based on my experience.
Right.
It can be pretty hardcore.
So that oil, though, so, you know,
Yeah.
like just on, you know, to finish that one point we were talking
Yeah.
about before that, is, you know, the oil was meant for tonic use to be tolerable. And we chose for this first part, we only have one strain of it right now. We chose a strain called Borogu, which is a very popular strain in Vanuatu that's very balanced, but it teeters more towards the daytime effect. So it elicits more of a calm focus. It's not going to put you to sleep. It offers a lot of those, you know, so, you know, we talk about those things that a lot of the, you know, the studies on Kava and stuff. Borogus are generally known for their neuroprotective effects, and all those effects are there in Borogu strains, but they just favor more of the nootropic kind of thing with the anxiety relief, and then still help with sleep later on, but don't put you to sleep. You know,
Right.
so what we want to do is have a whole class of different strains in the oils, and then, you know, working on these drinks that are even more powerful, that bring like the full recreational kick.
Boom.
Right.
That's what I'm talking about.
That's what we're trying to do.
Recreation, good sleep.
Safe recreational. There's
Yes,
not a lot
yes,
of
yes.
compounds that are safe and recreational. And if there's something available that people can gravitate towards, like either in the post-addiction phase or as an alternative, right? You know, something that
Sure.
you can get that relief without going into an altered state, without, you know, not being able to drive and having your faculties muddled, and that actually improves brain function at the same time. I mean, you know, there's so many reasons. We could go on forever. I know we're out of time here, but why that, you know, a lot of this is really one of these hidden gems, you know.
Well, it's not going to be hidden for long, my friend, and thank you for doing the tough work, the R&D, and being as obsessed about something as you are, and I mean that in the most positive sense, because, and that's why I have people like you on the show. It's like, I know when I talk to someone, I'm like, okay, they're doing it right, and it's an intuitive thing, and I just know, okay, I want to help get the word out, because I like to alleviate suffering in the world, and it takes someone who's dedicated to finding, you know, the power of these type of compounds that nature or God or creation has gifted to mankind, but it takes a responsible and intelligent steward in order to bring that to the public in a safe way. And my job is to be like, hey, here's a platform, man. Few tens of thousands of people are going to now hear you, try your stuff, or at least be educated about Kava in general. And maybe they start a company and they do it a different way that's also integrous and whatever. It's like, everyone wins. So I appreciate your dedication, and I appreciate the deep dive. I've got one closing question for you real quick. You've taught me a lot about your overcoming the struggles you've had, which is really inspiring and educational, because there were so many lessons baked in there, and of course everything I think I would ever need to know about Kava. Who have been 3 teachers or teachings generally in your life that you might point our listeners to go learn from?
Oh, wow. That's an interesting one.
That's my gotcha question at the end.
Yeah,
of every
exactly.
show.
I wish I would have had time to think about this. Yeah. Well, I'm going to have to say Dr. Pompa for one, because he's such a close friend of mine, and I wouldn't be doing any of this if it weren't for him. He inspired me, and he was that mentor catalyst. He was one of those, and he's involved in this project and stuff too. And you know, he's such an amazing guy, and he's changed so many lives and stuff too. You know, okay, so there's one. You know, number 2. So what was the question again? People who have inspired
People
me?
that have inspired or influenced you and your life's work.
So I got to say, you know, this is an easy one, but I got to say my parents, and maybe we can count both of them as one if you want to or whatnot. But like,
I like that.
My parents are they are one of the sole reasons why I'm still alive today, and a good support system. And I had a healthy reference point to fall back on when my life fell into total chaos. And, not everybody has that. I wouldn't be alive if it weren't for that, and them, for sure. And the third one, let's see. Gosh, there's so many researchers, scientists, ooh, that's a tough one. I don't know if I can choose one. Man, I would just say, yeah,
It could be anyone inspirational. It doesn't have to be within the health field or any of that.
Oh, I'll throw a random weird one at you.
Good. I was hoping for that. That's
Maybe
why
not so random.
That's why I didn't let you off the hook.
But because everything,
these.
we could say, like, we could dive into the specifics of, like, I learned specific things from, or like plant medicine or this or that or whatever. But I think our philosophies are where everything sort of emanates from. Whenever I was sick and going through a huge perceptual shift, I found a lot of comfort listening to Alan Watts lectures.
Oh, beautiful.
Beautiful stuff. I mean,
Great.
It's one of those things it's very, it's very just, basic stuff, but it's, well, not necessarily basic, but just very, philosophical type of, very introspective type thinking about oneself, and more on the sort of spiritual side of things from a broad perspective. And, those were, influential on me. And I always really, really enjoyed it. Because my philosophies have guided me, and we talked about different things like maybe psychedelic experience that have opened doors, but that whole process of perspective shift was huge for me. And people, like the 3 people I just named, or 4 people I just named, were pivotal and in my massive perspective shift. And I really think that that's what the world needs so much today, is perspective, right? Because so much of it have lost it. It's been beat out of us, or it's atrophied, and we really need real perspective as to how valuable life really is, right? And that it's absolutely worth, dedicating yourself to try to make it the best human experience as humanly possible for yourself and everybody else around you.
Hot damn. Drop the mic. Where can people find you on social media and a website?
Right. So, you can find me, my personal account, Cameron George, obviously, but Noble Roots Kava is our Instagram and Facebook. So we're on both those platforms. And, noblerootscava.com if you want to look at that stuff. And we're in the process of you're working to have a full informational website that has nothing to do with our specific product, just as far as Kava advocacy. That's not up yet, but you can stay tuned, for that, because I'll reference that once we, get that whole thing pulled together, because we want people to be able to go and educate themselves on this amazing plant too.
Awesome, man. Love it, dude. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, man. Yeah, thanks so much.